Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, there's a famous line from the Star Wars franchise where Lando Calrissian tells Darth Vader, "That wasn't the plan." And Vader replies, "I am altering the plan. Pray I don't alter it further." Sadly, this fictional scene is playing out right before us, where Washington is now altering the plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And we thought this was extremely interesting. And it is undoubtedly the United States is changing the plan because for decades of being an hegemonic power, the thing that characterized it was it would go to war with everyone. It would have regime change, would have color revolutions. It would just replace leaders with other leaders in a more sort of, in inverted commas, benign way. Well, now the United States is running out of those options because it backs a war against Russia and it failed. And in recent years, it's launched numerous wars or proxies and they've all failed. Particularly, I would say, in the last 25, 30 years, but even going back to Vietnam. In recent times, a lot of its color revolutions have failed, with countries such as Kazakhstan being an obvious example of that. And generally now it's tried and tested methods to implement the changes it needs have failed. The other thing, of course, it's a huge problem for the US is the global rejection of the US dollar, US Treasury complex, where previously, if nations threatened it, they could pick them off fairly easy on a one-to-one basis. But now, if it's got 50, 100 countries, what's it going to do? Try and implement regime change in those countries? Impossible. They're going to go to war with every one of them? Impossible. So now it's having to change plans. And those changing plans reflect a far broader, enormous problem the US faces now, which is not something people often will hear or anyone will discuss. And that is because the perception is that this is not possible because the United States has the US dollar. The United States can do whatever it likes. I mean, let's face it, in the past, it used to get issue worthless bits of paper. And in the return, it got loads of free dollars to spend. Well, as we said, that option doesn't exist anymore. And people will always say at the end of the day, well, the US financially can do whatever the hell it likes because it's big enough to be able to just say, well, on that basis, we'll just print and print and print. And yes, we have seen in recent years, particularly during the pandemic, but not exclusive, where the US was printing enormous sums of money. But the idea that eventually there isn't a price to pay is naive because there is. And yes, the US could carry on forever and a day printing, but in the end, they will debase the dollar so badly, and the world knows the United States has been printing money, particularly covertly. Hence why the forensic evidence that exists that the US can't account for at least $100 trillion. It probably is more. Then there's at least 200 to 250 trillion of unfunded liabilities. There's 37 trillion of debt. So sure, the US can go crazy printing, but if you want to Weimar Germany on steroids, then fine. But there are all going to be dire consequences for the US in doing so. So what we saw was evidence of the fact that in essence the United States was bankrupt and is bankrupt. And I'll just give a little bit of a pointer as to one example that highlighted this in the past, and we have talked about this, was when on I think at least three occasions during the Biden administration years, I think it was Yellen went, maybe someone else went in that period of time with a begging bowl, literally begging China to buy $500 trillion worth, no, $500 billion, sorry, dollars worth trillion of US treasuries to bail out the United States. And China sat there and went, forget it. We're not bailing you out. We bailed you out in 2008. We're not doing it again. So, and they went three times with a begging bowl and it failed. And that was the first big, huge indication. And this was going back through 2022, 2023, partly 2024 as well, where the US was signaling to the world that they were bankrupt. They were on their knees and they had nothing left to give. And I'll hand over to you, Ken. Then I think we can start to talk about some more examples where it's very obvious what's going on.
Yeah, and I'll definitely bring in the segue regarding that because when you take a look at what at least the Trump administration has sought to do and now has sort of evolved into doing, they wanted to quote unquote bring back industrialization. That was the whole, and this isn't new to Trump. That was part of his big deal back in 2016. But of course, the financial situation of the United States government and the U.S. as a whole is much worse. Uh, Going back to 2024, especially following the pandemic, as you mentioned, yelling, seeking a bailout from the Chinese, and all the money that was extraordinarily printed during the time of the pandemic. But when you take a look at first, it was tariffs, and there was some pseudo legitimacy against some nations in regards to tariffs, but it was also without the understanding of something we've talked about in the past, Triffin's dilemma or Triffin's paradox, where if you are going to be the sole holder of the reserve currency to the world, you can never have a trade surplus. It just isn't feasible because the rest of the world has to have dollars to be able to purchase things, commodities, resources, energy, etc., in dollars. And if you're going to force all the dollars back into the states because you are the industrial power and people are buying from you, well, that just doesn't work too well. It has all the inflation stay within your country. So tariffs were a way of sort of pulling back, getting a kickback on all the trade that was leading to the deficit. Well, now all those original deals, and we've talked about this before, many of those deals were simply just pie in the sky hyperbolic rhetoric where uh, Trump would go and he'd say, "Oh, I've got the UAE, which is going to give me $350 billion. The Japanese are going to give $500 billion. One of the hedge funds, Japanese money hedge funds, and Open GPT, we're going to invest $500 billion into this." All these different deals that you knew were pie in the sky. Well, then he started moving towards allies, Japan, South Korea, Europe. And there were the original deals that were discussed. But now it's moving on to an even greater thing where instead of loans, capital investment, etc., now they appear to be demanding cash. And that has moved from a trade deal into tribute from the vassals.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, the point with the tariffs is it was always a means by which to try and force countries to buy more US goods, even though the US doesn't produce the goods, so it was a complete waste of time. It was also a way of raising more capital and trying to fool the American people into believing the Chinese, the Indians, and everyone else was paying for it, when in fact it's the US consumer, importer, retailer who is the one paying for it. So they raise these derisory amounts of money, which never offset the fact that the United States is printing, well, is effectively having to print money just to manage its ever-growing budget deficit. It's also its interest payments are skyrocketing. Hence why they wanted to have interest rates slashed. So when they roll over trillions of dollars of debt, then it'd be cheaper to do so. Less interest payments. But again, comes back to the fact that the United States is destitute, bankrupt, and has no money. So the issue then comes about where the US then realizes, well, these tariff policies aren't really working. We threaten the world and they basically all laughed in our face, and a few nations panicked, like the United Kingdom. But then they started announcing all these deals they had with the Saudis, as you said, Ken, the UAE, etc., and for hugely bloated, inflated figures that nobody anywhere in these countries had any idea where the figure came from, but it all sounds very grandiose. And so we got trillions of dollars pouring into the country, which means that's going to pay for everything in the future. And of course, like all these deals, because it happened in Trump 1.0, where they announced massive deals with the Saudis, a few billion sort of trickled into the country, and that was it. So there was absolutely nothing of any substance. But again, this is desperation because the US needs money because it's bankrupt. And effectively, it faces capitulation financially. And again, it comes back to the point where people say, well, they can print. Yeah, sure. Print 50, $100 trillion and see what happens to the dollar. I mean, the dollar's already being rejected, not just because of US geopolitical attitudes, but also because nations have woken up to the fact that there's some very strange goings on inside the United States to do with these, to quote, magic money machines that just money gets produced or out of thin air from no one's quite sure where, and it doesn't really matter, but it appears and it's used to pay for things, and it's clearly printed money. So the fact that we know about it, I'm sure the global South countries know about it. So these trade deals, or these were, and it was always, you notice how it was worded to be along the lines of, well, you're going to invest all this money and we're going to have it invested in what we want to invest in. So you're going to give us money and invest, and we'll invest it for you and on your behalf. That is not how investment works. You put a proposal up. You want, I don't know, infrastructure rebuilding. You want to put new factories in place or new engineering facilities, industrial development, etc. Well, yeah, well, we're willing to finance that, but we're financing something we know we're invested in. So that was immediately a major red flag that proved the point that this was A, bogus, and B, it was really to do with the United States going, give us your money. And then, of course, the issue came about with South Korea, where there's talk of 350 billion. The South Koreans are going, hang on a minute. If we can't give you 350 billion, because if we do, our country will collapse, our currency will collapse. And then it was basically, as Ken said, we want 350 billion in cash. Well, that's the biggest indication you're ever going to hear that the United States is on its knees, it's financially destitute, it's bankrupt, it's ran out of options, it's had to change the plan so many times that now it's reached, rather than some quiet conversation with the Chinese, they've tried tariffs, they've tried trying to bully nations, threatening them with more tariffs, threatening them with sanctions. And none of it's working because the world doesn't listen to the US anymore. So now it's basically give us your money. And as you say, Ken, it's paying tribute to Caesar. Except it's not Caesar, it's Trump or Trump's administration. And the US is absolutely desperate because it's running out of options, and soon enough, it's going to default somewhat if things continue, and then it's game over. And of course, they can't allow that to happen. So that's when the printing presses will go into massive overdrive, and the US will have to print tens of trillions of dollars to bail everything out. Then it will totally destroy the dollar in the process. And this is why China's working at 100 miles an hour or a million miles an hour to try and roll out new, obviously, financial policy initiatives to try and get as much of the global south out of the dollar-based system, out of SWIFT, because they know what's coming. And it all comes back to begging China for a bailout and it failing, and it proves the United States is running on fumes.
Yeah, and I think one of the most important aspects of this as well is it has very, very much the potential to drive, especially South Korea and China, I mean, South Korea and Japan into China's bailiwick. They have already, the Trump administration has already forced Modi to pick a side when we had him shake hands with Xi in Tianjin. I think I said that right. Um, Earlier, during the SCO and the 80th anniversary. So if India now is being forced, to choose a side, South Korea really isn't that far away, especially if you take a look at some of their the way their politics is moving these days. They could be much more amenable to working with China than especially just losing everything by being forced to stay with the United States. And Japan is also coming because of their bond markets and what's happening in their financial system. They're going to need somebody who's going to support them rather than force them into pure bankruptcy by demanding tribute. So you see with India first, you see possibly with some other nations, China could be the biggest beneficiary, or rather than say China, the multipolar world and disconnect from the unipolar world could be the biggest beneficiary of this.
Well, yeah, I mean, but here's a really simple example that came up the last couple of days. The United States decided to put 100% tariffs on pharmaceutical imports. Where does it get a huge amount of its pharmaceutical imports from? India. So it puts 100% extra tariff on, and it's not just Indian pharmaceuticals, but they're the big provider. So we'll use that as an example. What does China do in response to that? China cuts a 30% tariff on Indian pharmaceuticals to the princely sum of 0%. So where does one suspect those Indian pharmaceuticals are going to be heading? Do we think they're still going to go to the US, or are they going to be sold to China? That's the leverage aspect of it. And this is why the United States just keeps digging a gigantic hole for itself. And that's just one very small but significant example amongst dozens and dozens of others where the US is desperate. It does come back to the fact that they're trying to change the plan. They're desperate to try and change the plan. It's been clearly obvious since the Trump administration came into office. But here's the difference. They want to change the plan in one sense, but the thing they want to keep is the US dollar as the world reserve currency. And you can't do that. And I think a final point I would make, again, that's rearing its head, is this idea as part of the way for the United States to dig its way out of the mess is to revalue the price of gold. Well, first off, they need to prove they've got gold because as things stand, it's clearly obvious they don't have any. And even if they do prove that they've got the gold, which is very unlikely, then the problem is, well, what are you going to reprice it to, and what benefit is that to the United States? But here's the thing. Imagine if they did reprice it, just for argument's sake, and this is not me saying this is what will happen to gold. It's not financial advice or anything like that because we don't give that. But say they decided to reprice gold to $10,000 an ounce. What do people think that is going to do to the dollar as a world reserve currency, or as it's just dead? Because you're basically saying to the world, our currency isn't worth the paper it's written on because I'm going to reprice it 2.5 times what it currently is. And even at 10,000, what's that going to raise? 2.5 trillion? That's like a drop in the ocean. It's nothing. It won't do anything to resolve any problems for the United States with its hundreds of trillions of dollars of problems. So I think it's worth throwing that in, but there's talk about that, and that's again just desperation and a clear indication. We, the United States, are bankrupt and we've run out of options and we've run out of plans. And the question is, what are they going to do next?
Well, if you think about it, perhaps the best thing they can do is allow the government shutdown to occur in a few days and then just fire two-thirds of federal workers. That might help balance the budget for about 2 months.
2 minutes.
Anyway, Paul, were there any final remarks you wanted to add to
No, I
this?
think that's fine.
Absolutely. To everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.